So that's the problem. My talk was titled Climate Disruption, What We Can Do. So I'll finally get to the what we can do. So I like this quote. This quote says, "The Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones." And you'll notice who said this. It's been attributed to other folks, but I'm pretty sure this is the first guy who said it. He was a Saudi oil minister, and he's referring to fossil fuels here. What he's saying is, our fossil fuel age is not going to end because we run out of fossil fuels, which would happen someday if we kept extracting them out of the ground. It's going to end because we have better options in front of us. And the Saudis know this, so why do we not know this? So what can we do? We basically have three different approaches we can take: mitigation, geoengineering, and adaptation. Those are our options. And I just found this picture yesterday. None of these options is going to be easy. They're all hard. So let's look at them one at a time. So adaptation, we heard a lot about this from John Eglander in the context of sea level rise. This is something we're going to have to do. We have no choice. We've already warmed up the planet a fair amount, and it's going to keep warming no matter what we do to some extent. Even if we stop burning fossil fuels, it's still going to get some amount warmer, and they're going to have more ice going into the oceans, and that's going to raise sea level, and we're going to have to deal with that no matter what. No matter what we do, we're going to have some big problems in front of us. As I told you, the weather's already changing. So what we're going to need to do is adapt. We're going to need to plan for these impacts. We're going to need to move people away from those low-lying areas. In places where it'll make sense, we can build seawalls. We're going to need to be more prepared to respond to major natural disasters like big hurricanes hitting populated areas and so on. We're going to have to do all of that. We have no choice. So that's just a given. A crazier thing to consider is geoengineering, which is using the planet Earth as a laboratory. The idea here is that on a global scale, if we want to stop this warming from happening, we could suck somehow carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere on a massive global scale, because that's what's causing the problem is the carbon dioxide, right? So if we could pull it out of the atmosphere, that would lead us to warm less. But to do that on a massive scale, you'd have to do some pretty crazy things, like growing huge amounts of algae in the oceans by fertilizing them, or developing new technologies that don't even exist today to capture, just man-made technologies to capture carbon dioxide out of the air. Another idea would be to keep sunlight from actually getting down to us in the first place. And there's various ways to do that. You can put mirrors in space. Sounds crazy, but people are talking about it. You could make rooftops everywhere white to try and reflect more sunlight back up, like the sea ice. You can make the oceans themselves. I mentioned oceans are dark, they absorb lots of energy. If you have machines making bubbles in the oceans, bubbly water's whiter, right? It's gonna reflect more light back up. These are all ideas that maybe they could work, but they're on a massive scale doing something to our planet, and I guarantee you every single one of those would have all kinds of unintended side effects that would probably, in many cases, be worse than the problem we're trying to solve in the first place. I don't think this is the idea that we should be following, geoengineering. So I mentioned we have to do adaptation. I sure as heck hope we don't have to do much geoengineering. The only option left is mitigation. And the way you mitigate the problem is you reduce your emissions. We stop putting so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So what can we do? Where can we get our energy from? So I have here a series of boxes that I've scaled in size to represent how much energy you could ever get worldwide from these different sources if you did it everywhere you could feasibly. And don't take them as precise numbers, they're plus or minus some amount, but they're approximately correct. So even if you got all the geothermal power you could everywhere on the planet, it's going to be a pretty small contributor. So geothermal energy, that's where you're drilling through the crust of the Earth and getting to that heat that's down under the crust, and using that heat to boil water, to make steam, to turn turbines, and make electricity. And you can do that where the Earth's crust is very thin. So in Iceland, for example, they get lots of energy from geothermal. But and I've nothing against geothermal, it's a great energy source. We should do it everywhere we can. But even if you did it everywhere you could, we're talking about a small contributor to our energy mix. You notice fossil fuels are a massive resource. So yeah, we're probably going to run out of oil, at some point in, some of the people in this room's lifetime or their children's lifetime. But there's enough coal to last maybe as long as 1,000 years. We're not going to run out of this stuff anytime soon. So we could power the entire planet with fossil fuels if we wanted to. That's essentially what we're doing today. You could scale up nuclear fission to power the entire planet. But to give you a sense of the scale we're talking about here, to get to that 30 terawatts, you would have to build a new nuclear power plant every day, starting today, all the way to the year 2050. That's a lot of nuclear power plants. And as we heard from Helen, there are some reasons why maybe we don't want to be thinking about nuclear at anywhere near that type of scale. So this is the box that we filled today. I gave you some numbers at the beginning. I said we use 18 terawatts worldwide today. That box is an 18 terawatt box. And so how are we filling that box today? Where does our energy come from? It looks like this. The black part of that box is the fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas. And you can see almost all of our energy is coming from those fossil fuels. Next would be nuclear and hydropower, and then pretty much inconsequential contributions from these other energy sources. But I'm not so much concerned about today. Well, I mean, I'm concerned about it, but I can't do anything about it. It is what it is. My question is, I have a 12-year-old I mentioned. What about when he's middle-aged, in the year 2050, when we're going to be using twice as much energy? 30 terawatts is the projection. Where are we going to get those 30 terawatts? That's a 30 terawatt box there. Again, almost twice as large as today. And there are lots of folks who are trying to project what our energy mix will look like in the year 2050. And there's, of course, all kinds of different opinions of what it might look like, but a general consensus picture of what people are projecting to look like is this. So this is a frightening projected scenario. That looks almost like it does today, right? Just everything is scaled up much bigger. So everything grew because we needed a lot more energy, but that box is still almost all fossil fuels all the way out in the year 2050. In fact, it's more fossil fuel use than we're using today, not less, because we need so much energy. This is unacceptable. The hidden costs associated with that energy use will ruin us all. This cannot be the scenario in the year 2050. So what can we do? So let's just do a hypothetical exercise. Let's say we didn't want to use any fossil fuels by 2050. And my guess is that no matter what we do, we will be using some still in 2050, but let's just say, hypothetically, we didn't want to use any. And let's say, following Helen's advice, we want to avoid nuclear as well. How much can we get from the renewable energy sources? If we do them everywhere, we get all the wind energy we can, all the biomass, all the geothermal, and so on. I'm going to empty those boxes out. How much energy can we get? And you notice we're coming up short. But also you'll notice, if you were paying attention, there was one box that I didn't show you yet, which was the solar energy box. So the question is, how big is that one? So I'm going to go from boxes to circles. So that is a circle on the left side. It's just too big to fit on the screen. That's a big circle. And that is the amount of energy that hits the surface of the Earth from the sun all the time. Huge amount of energy. It's actually enough energy hitting the surface of the Earth in 1 hour to power the entire planet for 1 year. But that's not a useful statement, because you can't capture all of the energy hitting the surface of the Earth. So the question is, how much could you actually get? What's feasible? So this is kind of a back-of-the-envelope estimate of what's feasible, what we could actually get. So the first thing I'm going to do is throw out the oceans. We're not going to cover the oceans with solar panels for all kinds of reasons. So I scale down to land area. But of course, we can't cover all the land area with solar panels either, right? Because we need farms and all kinds of other stuff. So what's a reasonable amount of land that we could cover? I'm going to say 2% is a reasonable amount of land. That's a lot of land. In the United States, roads cover roughly 2% of the land area, so you can get that in your head. We're talking about a lot of land, but it's possible. 2% of the United States would look like that. Now, I'm not saying we're going to put all the panels in west central Kansas, but that's 2% of the United States, of course, spread out around. So that's feasible, I think. But we have another problem. You can't convert sunlight to electricity with 100% efficiency. There are fundamental losses in that process. The basic laws of thermodynamics limit you to about 30%, is about the best you can do for a power conversion efficiency. You can buy panels for your rooftop today, commercially if you want, that do it at 20%. So that's a commercial product today, 20% power conversion efficiency. I'm going to be much more conservative. I'm going to say 12%. So that's a very realistic number for an average power conversion efficiency. But now we're down to that measly little circle, right? That tiny little circle there compared to that massive one we started with. But that tiny little circle is that yellow box. So the feasible solar energy supply, what we could actually get, is more than 2 times larger than the total projected global energy demand all the way out in the year 2050. In fact, it's bigger supply than the projected global energy demand in the year 2100. So this is really an inexhaustible energy source for the foreseeable future. Now, I don't say that to say we should get all of our energy from solar energy. In fact, that would be a bad idea. You want an energy mix for all kinds of reasons. For one, that the sun does not shine all the time. Well, it shines all the time, but it doesn't shine on you all the time. So you need a mix of energy sources, wind, and you need baseload power from hydropower and so on. But it's got to be a much, much bigger piece of the puzzle than it's projected to be. and a heck of a lot bigger piece than what it is today. And by the way, it's not surprising that the solar resource is so much larger than things like wind and biomass and hydropower, because those really are solar energy going through extra steps. The reason the wind blows is that the sun heats up the air and it starts to move around through convection and so on, and that creates wind currents, some of which you can capture with turbines. So of course it's going to be less energy overall because it's going through extra steps. Same thing with biomass. Biomass is using crops that turn sunlight into chemical fuel by photosynthesis, extra steps. Hydropower happens because the sun evaporates water, mostly from the oceans, goes into the air. Some of that rains down on high elevations and comes down rivers that we can dam up and get hydropower. Solar power going through extra steps, so those boxes are smaller, not surprisingly. So why are we not all using solar energy today? That's actually a complicated question, and there are lots of answers to it, but one of the big ones is this one, and this is really a question about tackling climate disruption in general. It's a principle in economics called the tragedy of the commons. And what the tragedy of the commons is the depletion of a common resource by individuals acting in their own rational best interests, even knowing that they're sacrificing their long-term interests. Let me give you some examples. Overfishing. So overfishing happens because these fishermen go out and they want to get as many fish as they can to make as much money as they can so they can make a living. So they all go out there and they get too many fish, and then what's going to happen? There's not enough fish for any of them, and then they're all out of business, right? But each one of them they're not stupid, right? They're getting those fish because that's how they make money. They're doing it in their own individual best interest in the shorter run. Another example would be the use of freeways. Freeways seem like the best way to get to work, right? It's a big highway that takes you straight there, but when everybody does that, it looks like this. Depletion of a shared resource. Each one of those individuals is making what seems like the smart choice, taking the most direct path to work, but when everybody does it, it makes it bad for everybody. Another example would be public restrooms. I won't go into the details on that one, but you get the picture. So what this means is that we must act collectively. You can't rely on individuals or individual nations even to make the right choices here, because if each nation is only looking at its own interests and only in the relatively short term, they're not going to change their energy mix on the type of scale that we need to do or on the time scale that we need to do. We need to do it together. And people are trying to do this. You've probably heard of the Kyoto Protocol, the climate agreement that happened back in 1997. What you may not know is that actually these things happen every year. The UN holds one of these climate conferences, and it actually started before the Kyoto Protocol. So we've been making efforts to do something about this for a long time, and we're making progress, but it's slow progress, unfortunately too slow. So we need folks like you to start pushing some more energy behind this and do something about it on a time scale that's actually going to make a difference. So what can we do? Well, it's the sort of things that the Kyoto Protocol tried to do. So the problem is that all the carbon dioxide we're putting in the atmosphere. And I mentioned that the reason we're burning those fossil fuels, well, you told me, was because they're cheap. Now, of course, if you count for all those hidden costs, they're not cheap. They're really, really expensive, right? And solar and wind and everything are actually much, much cheaper when you look at the whole picture. But nobody looks at the whole picture. They just look at what they're paying the electric bill to the company. And in that context, at least in places that aren't very sunny, things like solar don't look as competitive. But what you can do is you can take that cost, that hidden cost, and monetize it. Put it in front of people so they can see it. For example, with a carbon tax. So if you had to take that social cost of carbon that we're all paying but we don't realize and put it on your electric bill or at the gas pump or whatever, I guarantee you're going to start looking for a different way to get your energy because suddenly it's going to look a lot more expensive to be getting it from burning the coal. So that lets the market take care of the problem for you. Cap and trade is another way to do this. This is where you decide this is how many carbon emissions the planet can tolerate, total, and then you break that down and say, this nation is allowed to emit this much carbon. And then within that nation, they'll give each company, they'll say, you're allowed to emit this much, and you this much, and you that much. And then what happens is, if a company can become more efficient and use less fossil fuel, they can sell that right to emit to someone else, and they make money. So it's good for them. But overall, the system keeps getting more efficient that way because everybody wants to be more efficient and make money. That's what cap and trade's all about. We also can just be a lot more efficient. So energy efficiency is the cheapest energy source. Those boxes I showed you, I didn't show you a box for energy efficiency. It's really an energy source, even though it's us using less energy, because we don't have to make the energy if we're not using it, right? So it's like a source. And there's so many ways that we could be more efficient. It's not just switching to LED light bulbs, but driving more efficient cars, carpooling, all the stuff you guys already know. We have to do all that, and that is the cheapest thing to do. We should do that first, absolutely, as much as possible. But even if we're as efficient as possible, that doesn't get us there, not even close. We have to do that and a lot more. And the last step here is we really need to support the research and development infrastructure of this nation and globally as well. Because we're going to need some new technologies to get us around this problem in all kinds of arenas. We need to do better modeling of our climate. We need to do better forecasting of how it's going to impact fisheries and all other parts of our economy. We need to develop lower cost solar technologies, more efficient wind turbines, cars that get more miles per gallon. All of these things require research and development. And the way it works now, years ago, companies used to do a lot of that R&D. But most of the industrial R&D infrastructure in the United States, at least, is gone. The great research labs, Bell Laboratories, and so on, these things are basically gone. So who's doing all that research? Government-supported research at universities and at national laboratories, and we need to support them because they're the ones developing the solutions to these problems. So I like this picture. That little tiny sliver of blue that you see there, that's our atmosphere. This is obviously a picture taken from space with the sun just on the other side there, just peeking up, so you can light up the atmosphere like that. And I like this picture because it really shows how delicate and razor thin that atmosphere is. It looks big to us when we look up in the sky. It seems to go on forever, right? But it's actually a really delicate, very thin envelope around us that allows all of us to live. And even though we're only talking about parts per million of CO2, and the atmosphere looks so big, we are changing it. We are putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it is changing our climate already, and we'll be doing much more so in the future. And that's a very delicate blanket that we all need to survive. I think we need to take a little more care for it, respect it a little more. And let me just end with this sentiment, which is there's a lot of debate. It's unfortunately become politicized about climate change, climate disruption, where people think, if you support it, if you believe in it, you're a tree hugger. First of all, believe in it doesn't even make sense. It's there whether you believe in it or not. It's happening, right? But it doesn't matter what party you vote for. It doesn't matter what church you go to or synagogue or mosque or temple, or if you don't believe in God at all. There's something that we all agree on, and that is that we want our children's lives to be better than our own, or at least as good as our own. And that future is at risk because of what we're doing to our planet. So I think it's time for us all to get together and solve this problem. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.